The day Cornelius Vane rode up to Minnie Harper's door with a bouquet of hothouse roses and a deed to 300 acres of prime grazing land, the whole town of Callow Creek held its breath. And the day she sent him away was the day everyone decided she had lost her mind entirely. It was the spring of 1878, and Callow Creek sat like a sun-bleached seed pod in the wide, red-dusted basin of southwestern Texas, stubborn and alive against all reasonable expectation. The town had grown up around a single well and a single trading post, and it had kept growing the way a cactus grows, slowly, painfully, with sharp edges in every direction. There were maybe 300 souls in Callow Creek proper, not counting the ranchers spread out across the surrounding valley, and of all those souls, none commanded more respect and envy and whispered admiration than Cornelius Vane, who owned the Vane Land and Cattle Company, and whose name appeared on the deed of roughly 1/3 of everything worth owning within a 40-mile radius. Minnie Harper was 27 years old, a widow of 14 months, and the owner of a small homestead on the eastern edge of town that consisted of a modest frame house, a vegetable garden that she coaxed out of the rocky soil through sheer stubbornness, a milk cow named Agnes, 2 chickens named Pearl and Edith, and a boy named Caleb who was 6 years old and had his father's dark eyes and his mother's habit of asking questions that had no comfortable answers. Her husband, Thomas Harper, had died of a fever in the winter of 1877, leaving her with the house, the cow, the chickens, the boy, and a small debt at the general store that she had spent the intervening months paying down with the money she earned taking in sewing and laundry. She was not destitute. She was not comfortable either. She existed in that narrow, hard seam between survival and ruin that so many women in the West knew all too well, and she navigated it with a quiet, iron-spined dignity that people in town both admired and found slightly unnerving. She was not beautiful in the way that the illustrated papers from back east described beauty. She was strong-featured and direct-eyed, with dark chestnut hair that she wore pinned up tight under a faded sunbonnet when she went to town, and hands that showed the work she did. But there was something in her face, some quality of absolute, unflinching presence, that made men look twice and then look away feeling obscurely ashamed, as though they had been caught doing something small. Cornelius Vane had been looking at Minnie Harper for 6 months before he finally rode up to her door on that warm April morning, with his roses and his deed, and his most carefully pressed coat. He was 44 years old, broad-shouldered, silver-haired at the temples, with a thick mustache and the kind of authoritative bearing that came from decades of being the most important man in any room. He was not cruel. He was not dishonest, particularly. He was simply accustomed to getting what he wanted, and what he wanted, he had decided with the calm certainty of a man placing a business order, was Minnie Harper. He tied his horse to her fence post, walked up the path through the vegetable garden with his hat in one hand and the roses in the other, and knocked on her door with the brass-knuckled confidence of a man who had never been seriously refused anything in his adult life. Minnie opened the door, looked at the roses, looked at the deed he extended toward her when she said nothing, and then looked at his face for a long, considering moment. "Mr. Vane," she said finally, "I appreciate you riding out. Mrs. Harper," he gave her the smile that had charmed 3 county commissioners and a territorial judge, "I think you know why I've come." "I expect I do," she said. "I'm offering you a good life," he said. "Better than good. You'd want for nothing and the boy would want for nothing. I've got the biggest house in the valley, good water, good grass. I'm a fair man and I'd treat you well." He extended the deed a little further. "This land here I'd put directly in your name, as a gesture of good faith." Minnie looked at the deed. She looked at the roses. She looked at the wide, well-fed confidence of him, and something moved across her face, not cruelty, not contempt, but a kind of deep, sad recognition, as though she were looking at something she had already understood and already grieved. "Mr. Vane," she said, and her voice was gentle but absolutely clear, the way the air is clear just before a storm breaks, You are offering me security, and I understand that. I understand that you think it's a kind offer, and maybe by some measure it is. But I can't marry a man because he is the richest man in the valley. I have to be able to look at my boy and tell him something true about why I chose the life I chose." She paused. "I hope you find what you're looking for. I genuinely do." She handed him back the deed. Cornelius Vane stood on her front path for a moment that felt, to the distant observer of Martha Cade's front window 2 properties over, like a very long time indeed. Then he put his hat back on, tucked the deed back into his coat, and walked to his horse with measured steps that would not betray him. The roses he left leaning against her fence post, because he was too proud to take them back and too dignified to throw them down. The story was all over Callow Creek by suppertime. By the following morning, the consensus at the barber shop and the general store and the water trough outside the church was divided between those who thought Minnie Harper was a fool and those who thought she was a saint, with very little territory between those two positions. Nobody asked August Redmond what he thought, because August Redmond was not the kind of man whose opinion was sought on matters of importance. He was 29 years old, lean as a fence rail, brown as saddle leather from the sun, and he worked odd jobs around Callow Creek with a cheerful consistency that most people found either admirable or pathetic depending on their mood. He had no land of his own. He had a rented room above the livery stable that he shared with the considerable collection of dust that blew in through the one window, and he had a horse named Ferdinand who was not young and not fast but was genuinely good-tempered, and he had his tools, a good hammer, a reliable saw, a set of chisels that he kept sharp as principle, and he had, as far as anyone could tell, no ambitions beyond the day in front of him. He had come to Callow Creek 3 years earlier from somewhere in New Mexico territory that he did not discuss, and he had established himself quietly as the man you called when a fence needed mending, or a roof needed patching, or a well needed cleaning. He was good with his hands, patient with difficult work, and remarkably cheerful for someone whose material circumstances were so consistently modest. He was tall enough that he had to duck under most door frames. He had gray eyes that were unusually direct and a slow, warm smile that arrived on his face like sunrise gradually and then all at once. He was not flashy. He was not loud. He was simply, unremarkably, quietly there, day after day, in the way that reliable things are there. He heard about Minnie Harper turning down Cornelius Vane the way he heard most things in Callow Creek, at the livery stable, from a man named Purvis Dodd who carried gossip with the same dutiful regularity that he carried feed sacks. "Sent him off with his hat in his hand," Purvis said, with a kind of gleeful satisfaction that betrayed his long-standing dislike of Cornelius Vane. "Just handed him back that deed, right there at her front door." August was brushing Ferdinand down, and he kept brushing, his strokes long and even. "Good for her," he said. Purvis looked surprised. "You think she did right?" "I think a woman's got the right to say no to a man she doesn't want to marry," August said, without looking up from the horse's flank. "Even if he's the richest man in the valley, especially if he's the richest man in the valley." Purvis considered this. "She's going to have a hard time of it on her own." "She's been having a hard time of it on her own," August said. "Seems like she's managing." He had seen Minnie Harper around town, of course. Everyone had seen Minnie Harper around town. He had seen her at the general store, precise and careful with her few coins, and at the church on Sundays, sitting straight-backed in the third pew with Caleb pressed against her side. He had seen her once when she was wrestling a loose board back onto her front porch. He had been walking past on his way to a job at the mill, and he had stopped and offered to help, and she had looked at him with those direct brown eyes and said, "I'd be grateful," without any of the fluttering and disclaiming that some women performed when they were caught doing something physical. And he had fixed the board, and she had brought him a cup of water afterward, and they had stood there in the morning sun for maybe 10 minutes talking about nothing in particular. Whether the spring rains would be enough, whether the Millers were really selling their place and moving east, and then he had gone on his way and she had gone back to her garden, and that had been the whole of it. But he had thought about those 10 minutes more than was probably reasonable in the weeks since they had occurred. Now, hearing about what she had done, he felt something move in his chest, some complicated mixture of admiration and a kind of rueful, private recognition. She had turned down the richest man in the valley because she would not be bought. That was the truth of it, stripped clean. And something about that stripped, clean truth made August feel, in a way he could not quite articulate, that he had been waiting to hear exactly this piece of news for longer than he had known he was waiting. He did not act on this feeling immediately. That was not his way. He was not an impulsive man. He let things settle in him like silt settling in a stream slowly until they became the floor. He went on doing his odd jobs. He fixed a section of the Garrett family's stone wall that had collapsed over the winter. He reshingled a portion of the church roof when Pastor Briggs said the rain was coming in. He helped haul lumber for the new stage depot that was going up on the north end of town. And through all of this, he kept an unobtrusive eye on Minnie Harper's situation, the way a man keeps an eye on the sky when he knows weather might be coming, not interfering, just watching. What he saw was this: she was working very hard. She was doing the work of the homestead and the work of the sewing and the laundry and the work of raising a small boy, and she was doing all of it with that straight-backed, iron-spined composure that never quite let you see what it was costing her. But it was costing her. He could see that in the shadows under her eyes and in the way she moved sometimes at the end of the day carefully, like someone trying not to let the ache show. He also saw something else, and this was the thing that got to him, quietly and persistently, like water finding its way through stone. He saw how she was with her boy. He saw her catch Caleb when he ran to her after school with some story about a frog he'd found, and the way her whole face changed when she looked at him, that total, transforming tenderness that was so different from the composed, guarded expression she showed the rest of the world. He saw her sit with him on the front porch in the evenings when the work was done, pointing out stars, telling him things. He saw the boy reach up and pat her cheek once, the small gesture of comfort running in both directions, child to mother and mother to child. August Redmond had not had that. He had grown up in a household that was not cruel but was empty of that particular warmth, and he recognized it the way a man who has been cold for a long time recognizes a fire. He recognized it, and he felt toward it the way a compass feels toward north, not by choice, but by nature. It was in the first week of May, 6 weeks after Cornelius Vane's visit, that August had occasion to speak to Minnie again in any real way. He was working at the mill when he heard from young Tommy Garrett that Minnie Harper's roof was leaking. Not just leaking, a section over the kitchen had begun to sag, and if it was not dealt with before the summer rains came in earnest, there was a real possibility of it failing entirely. Tommy had heard this from his mother, who had heard it from Martha Cade, who had seen Minnie looking at it with an expression that was the closest Martha had ever seen her come to visible worry. August finished the job at the mill, collected his pay, which was modest, because modest was what he earned, and spent a quiet hour doing arithmetic in his head. He had some savings, not much. Enough, just barely, to cover the materials for a roof repair if he did the labor himself, and did not eat anything extravagant for the next month. The question was whether Minnie Harper would accept the help. He knew enough about her, from what he had observed and what was generally known, to understand that this was not a small question. She was not someone who accepted charity. She was not someone who accepted anything she had not fairly earned. The Cornelius Vane episode had made that clear enough. He thought about it for a day. Then he went to the general store and spoke to Bill Hannigan, who sold lumber and roofing materials among his other goods, and he arranged for a supply of cedar shingles and supporting boards to be set aside. Then he walked to Minnie Harper's house on a Tuesday morning when he knew from observation that she would be home. Tuesday was her sewing day, not her laundry day, and he knocked on her door. She opened it with a piece of fabric in her hands and a look of mild inquiry on her face that shifted to something more careful when she saw who it was. "Mr. Redmond," she said. He was pleased that she knew his name and then felt slightly foolish for being pleased. "Mrs. Harper." He took his hat off. "I hope I'm not interrupting." "You're not," she said. "What can I do for you?" "I was hoping," he said, choosing his words with the same care he chose his tools, "that it might be the other way around. What I can do for you." He could see her expression beginning to close, and he kept going before it could. "Now, I know you're not looking for charity, and I'm not offering any. I'm a carpenter by trade and by inclination, and I have heard, through the way news travels in this town, that your roof needs attention. I also happen to know that good roof repairs need doing before summer, and that doing them after a roof fails costs 3 times what doing them before costs." He paused. "I'm not a wealthy man, Mrs. Harper, but I do good work. I was thinking we might make an arrangement. You have a kitchen garden, and I'm a man who eats plain and does not always eat well. If you were willing to provide me meals for the time it takes to do the work a week, maybe 10 days, I'd consider a square. No charity involved, just a fair trade." She looked at him for a long moment. He could see her turning it over, looking at it from different angles, the way she would examine a piece of fabric for flaws. "I've seen your work, Mr. Redmond," she said finally. "That wall you built for the garrets holds straight." "I try to do things right," he said. "And you'd truly be satisfied with meals as payment." "I'd be more than satisfied," he said honestly. "I eat a lot of beans." Something moved across her face then, not quite a smile, but the architecture of one, the suggestion of warmth held carefully in check. "All right," she said. "When can you start?" "Tomorrow morning," he said, "if that suits you." "It suits me," she said. He put his hat back on. "I'll be here at first light." He was, and that was how it began. The first morning, they were careful with each other, polite and businesslike, each operating within a clearly understood boundary. He arrived before the sun was fully up, and she had coffee on the stove and a plate of cornbread on the table, and they said good morning and spoke briefly about the scope of the work, and then he took his tools up onto the roof and she went back to her sewing, and the morning settled into a quiet, industrious rhythm. Caleb was the first one to break through the formality, because Caleb was 6 and formality had not yet been explained to him. He appeared at the foot of the ladder that August had propped against the eave, looked up with his father's dark eyes at this tall man perched on his mother's roof, and announced without preamble, "My mama says you are going to fix the part that drips on the butter dish." August looked down at him. "That's the plan," he said. "The butter dish is very important," Caleb said gravely. "Mama sets great store by it. It was her grandmother's." "Then we'll make sure the butter dish is safe," August said with equal gravity. Caleb considered this satisfactory. "Can I watch?" "You can watch from the ground," August said. "Roofs are not for boys of your size. Come up here in 10 years and I'll teach you what I know." Caleb accepted this negotiation with the pragmatism of a child accustomed to reasonable adults. He sat down on the grass and watched August work with the focused attention of someone learning something important, and August found that he did not mind being watched. He told the boy the names of the tools as he used them, and why each one was necessary, and Caleb received this information like a bank receiving deposits. When Minnie appeared in the yard at noon with a plate of food, she found her son sitting cross-legged on the grass, conducting what appeared to be a fairly sophisticated conversation with the man on her roof about the structural properties of cedar versus pine. She stood and listened for a moment, unnoticed, and the expression on her face was one that she was not aware of, open and wondering and almost bewildered, as though she had been expecting rain and found instead that the sky had turned a color she had no name for. She called up to August that lunch was ready, and when he climbed down and washed his hands at the pump and sat at the table she had set outside in the shade of the old live oak, the 3 of them ate together with a naturalness that surprised all of them, though each one would have been slow to admit it. August told a story about a roof he had once repaired in New Mexico that had collapsed while he was standing on it, depositing him neatly into what turned out to be a very surprised woman's kitchen. And Caleb laughed so hard he nearly choked on his cornbread. And Minnie sat back in her chair and laughed too, a real laugh, surprised out of her, and the sound of it did something to the air around the table, made it feel warmer and more alive. "You weren't hurt?" she asked, when they had recovered. "My pride took the worst of it," August said. "The woman was very gracious about the whole thing. She offered me pie." "Well," Minnie said, her eyes still bright with the laughter, "if you fall through mine, there's a vinegar pie in the larder." "That's the best insurance policy I've ever heard of," he said. Over the 10 days of the roof repair, a pattern established itself so naturally that neither of them paused to examine it. August arrived at first light and worked steadily through the morning. At noon they ate together under the oak tree, and in the evenings, if he was still working when the light began to go, she brought out a lamp and set it on the fence post, and sometimes, not every evening but sometimes, he would stay a while after the tools were put away, sitting on the porch step or leaning against the fence, and they would talk. They talked about everything and nothing. About the spring and whether the creek would flood again. About Caleb's education. There was a one-room school in town, run by a young woman named Miss Evelyn Porter who had come from Ohio and seemed perpetually startled by Texas, but was determined to be useful regardless. About Thomas, Minnie's husband, tentatively at first and then more directly August asked careful, respectful questions, and she answered them with the thoughtful honesty of a woman who had done her grieving and was not afraid of the memory. Thomas had been a good man, she said. Not an easy man, but a good one. The fever had taken him in 3 days. There was nothing anyone could have done. "Do you miss him?" August asked once. In that direct way he had that could have been intrusive but somehow never was, because it was entirely free of prurience. He was simply asking because he wanted to know, and she could feel the difference. "I miss having someone to talk to at the end of the day," she said honestly. "I miss Caleb having a father. I miss the weight of another person in the house, the sound of someone else breathing." She paused. "I loved Thomas, but I have thought since he died that maybe what I miss most is not Thomas specifically but the life we had together. Is that terrible to say?" "No," August said quietly. "I think that's one of the most honest things I've heard said about grief." She looked at him. "What do you know about grief, Mr. Redmond?" "August," he said, "please, if we're going to talk honestly." "August," she said, and his name in her mouth felt like something being unlocked. He was quiet for a moment, looking out at the darkening sky to the west where the last light was pulling back like a tide. "My mother died when I was 11, he said. "My father, he was a decent man, but not a demonstrative man. After she was gone, the house went quiet in a way that never fully came back. I grew up in that quiet." He turned his gray eyes to her face. "So I know what you mean, about missing the sound of someone else breathing." She said nothing for a moment, and the silence between them was not empty. It was full of something, recognition, or the beginning of it. "Good night, August," she said finally, gently. "Good night, Minnie," he said, and used her name for the first time, and neither of them remarked on it, and both of them heard it like a note struck true on a piano that has been out of tune for a long time. He finished the roof on a Friday. He did thorough work, not just the sagging section over the kitchen, but a full inspection of everything, replacing any shingle that showed weakness, reinforcing the ridgeline where the wood had dried and cracked, clearing the gutters of debris that had accumulated since Thomas Harper's death. When he was done, it was a better roof than it had been even before the damage. He came down the ladder for the last time with his tools in his bag and found Minnie standing in the yard, looking up at what he had done with an expression that was, for once, entirely unguarded. "It's a good roof," she said. "It'll hold," he said. "You won't lose any more butter dishes." She turned to look at him, and there was something in her face, a warmth and a sadness and a determination all at once that made him very still. "Thank you," she said. "I mean that truly, not just for the roof." He understood what she meant. "Thank you for the meals," he said. "I haven't eaten that well I'm not sure I've eaten that well." She smiled, and this time she did not hold it in check, and it was extraordinary, that smile. It changed the whole geography of her face, opened it up like country seen from a high ridge. He wanted to say something more. He had things he could have said. But there was something in the moment that felt too precious to risk with clumsiness, and so he put his hat on and shouldered his bag and said, "If anything else needs doing, I hope you'll let me know." "I will," she said. He walked away down the road in the late afternoon light, and she watched him go from the yard, and Caleb appeared at her elbow and said, "Is he coming back?" With the plain, pragmatic urgency of a 6-year-old who has formed an attachment. "I don't know," she said honestly. "I hope he does," Caleb said. "He told me the names of every tool." She looked down at her son's dark-eyed face and felt something complicated move through her love for him, and tenderness, and the sharp awareness of his need, and beneath all of it, something quieter and more personal that she was not yet prepared to name. Callow Creek in the spring of 1878 was not a place where romance occurred in private. The town was too small and too watchful, and the 10 days of August Redmond working on Minnie Harper's roof had not escaped notice. It was remarked upon at the general store and at the barber shop and over back fences, with varying degrees of benevolence. Most people were genuinely well-disposed toward Minnie, and most people found August Redmond likable if unimpressive, and the general consensus was a mixture of hopeful curiosity and practical skepticism. What kind of future could a woman build with a man who had no land and no savings and no prospects beyond his own 2 hands? The person who expressed this most forcefully was Minnie's neighbor Martha Cade, a well-meaning woman of 50 who had appointed herself something of a guardian of Minnie's interests since Thomas's death. She came over on the Saturday morning after the roof was finished, ostensibly to return a borrowed sugar bowl, and she sat at Minnie's kitchen table with the look of a woman who has prepared a speech. "He's a nice enough man," Martha said, with the careful precision of someone placing a pin. "I'm not saying anything against him personally." "I know you're not," Minnie said, pouring coffee. "But Minnie, you have a boy to think about. You have a homestead to maintain. You've already turned down Cornelius Vane, and I understand why, truly I do, but there must be a middle ground between the richest man in the valley," and she paused delicately, "a man who patches roofs for his supper." Minnie set the coffee cups down and sat across from Martha, and she looked at her neighbor with those direct, composed eyes. "Martha," she said, "he asked me for nothing. He saw a need and he offered his work, and he asked for a fair trade, not charity and not anything else. He sat at my table for 10 days and was kind to my son and honest with me and asked nothing he wasn't owed." She paused. "I don't know what is between us, if anything is. But I know that how a man behaves when he wants nothing from you tells you more about him than anything else ever will." Martha was quiet for a moment. Then she said, somewhat reluctantly, "He does fine work. I'll grant him that." "He does," Minnie said. More coffee. August, for his part, went back to his odd jobs with his outer life entirely unchanged and his inner life considerably disrupted. He had not meant to fall in love. He had not, if he was being truthful with himself, thought of the roof work as anything other than what it appeared to be on the surface: a fair trade, a practical kindness, a way of being useful to someone who needed it. He had not planned the evenings on the porch, or the lunches under the oak tree, or the conversations that moved between the practical and the personal with a naturalness he had not experienced before. He had not planned any of it, and yet here he was, a man who had been perfectly content with his modest life, finding that his modest life now had a hole in it the exact shape of Minnie Harper. He saw her at church on Sundays. They nodded. He saw her at the general store. They exchanged pleasantries about the weather and the state of the road to the mill. He saw her once in conversation with Miss Evelyn Porter outside the school, laughing about something, her head tilted back, and the sight of her laughing at a distance did things to his chest that he found medically alarming. He was not, he told himself, going to make a fool of himself. He was a man with nothing to offer. He had his tools and his hands and his willingness to work, and those things were real and good, but they were not what men like Cornelius Vane offered. The woman had already turned down the best material offer in the valley. What on earth would she do with him? This reasoning was sound. He applied it rigorously for approximately 3 weeks, and it held up exactly as well as a fence built from sound reasoning usually holds up when something living wants through it. The thing that got through was a small thing, as these things often are. It was a Wednesday evening in the last week of May, and August was walking back from a job at the far end of town, a stable repair for a rancher named McCormick, and he passed the Harper homestead on his way and saw that the gate to the vegetable garden was open and swinging on its hinge, and the garden itself was empty and the house was dark. He stopped. He stood at the fence and looked at the dark house and the open gate, and felt a cold current move through him that he recognized, after a moment, as fear. He was being irrational. She was almost certainly at Martha Cade's, or visiting someone in town, or in the back of the house where the lamp couldn't be seen from the road. There were a dozen entirely ordinary explanations. He pushed the gate open and walked up the path. He knocked on the front door. Silence. He knocked again. Then he heard a sound from inside the house, muffled, which resolved itself as he listened into the sound of a child crying. He tried the door. It was unlocked. "Mrs. Harper," he called from the threshold. "Minnie, it's August Redmond. I'm coming in." He found Caleb in the kitchen, sitting on the floor beside the cold stove, tear-streaked and frightened, pressing a folded cloth against a cut on his arm that was bleeding more than it was dangerous. The boy looked up at him with his father's dark eyes and said, in a shaking voice that was trying very hard to be steady, "I cut it on the tin and Mama went to get Dr. Pierce and I was trying to hold it like she showed me, but it keeps going." August crossed the room, knelt down, and looked at the cut. It was not deep. It needed cleaning and bandaging, not stitching. He was calm as he assessed it, and his calm was deliberate. The boy needed someone calm. "You did right," he said. "You held the cloth on it just like she showed you. You did exactly right." He looked around the kitchen, found the clean rags Minnie kept folded by the water pail, and found the bottle of whiskey in the cabinet above the stove. It had been Thomas Harper's, and Minnie kept it for medicinal purposes only. He cleaned the cut with quick, sure hands and wrapped it tight with a clean strip of cloth while Caleb hissed through his teeth and did not cry, though his face went white. "There," August said. "That'll hold until your mother gets back with the doctor." Caleb looked down at the neat bandage on his arm. Then he looked up at August with an expression that was, in its rawness, one of the most affecting things August had ever seen: relief and trust, and something exhausted and childlike underneath. "I was scared," Caleb said quietly, as though making a confession. "I know," August said. "That's all right. Being scared and holding on anyway is what brave looks like. You held on." Caleb leaned forward without warning and put his head against August's shoulder, and August, after a moment's surprised stillness, put his arm around the boy, and they sat there on the kitchen floor until they heard Minnie's quick footsteps on the porch. She came through the door with Dr. Pierce behind her and stopped dead when she saw them, her son bandaged and leaning against this man who was sitting on her kitchen floor with his arm around Caleb and his face turned toward the door, calm and present as bedrock. "He's all right," August said immediately, standing. "Clean cut, not deep. I've wrapped it. He held the cloth on it just like you'd shown him. He did well." Minnie crossed the room in 3 steps and went to her knees in front of Caleb, her hands going to his face and then to his arm, checking, reassuring herself. "My darling," she said, low and fierce. I'm here, doctor." Pierce examined the wound, declared the bandaging competent, redressed it with his own materials, and left with the brisk efficiency of a man who had more calls to make. Minnie saw him to the door and thanked him, and then came back into the kitchen where August was standing by the stove, giving them space. Caleb had fallen asleep in the chair, exhausted by fright and relief, the neat bandage pale against his small arm. Minnie looked at her sleeping boy for a long moment. Then she looked at August. "Thank you," she said, and her voice was different, stripped down, the composure gone, something real and unprotected in it. I don't know what I would have if you hadn't. He would have been all right, August said gently. He was managing, he's a brave boy. He is, she said, he is. She pressed her fingers to her lips for a moment, steadying herself. Why were you here? Were you passing? I was passing, he said. The gate was open and the house was dark and he stopped. I was worried, he said simply. She looked at him for a long time and something was shifting in her face slowly like weather changing. August, she said. Yes. Would you stay for supper? She asked. I know it's late and you've had a long day, but she paused, and the unfinished sentence had a quality to it that he felt in his chest. I think I would be grateful for company tonight. Yes, he said, without hesitation. I'll stay. They ate supper late after she had put Caleb to bed, and they sat at the kitchen table where the lamp put warm light into the room, and the night outside was soft with the sounds of spring crickets beginning, and the far call of an owl and the creek running over stones somewhere beyond the garden. They talked for a long time about many things, and somewhere in the middle of talking about something else entirely, the conversation turned to loneliness, and neither of them pulled away from it. There are times, Minnie said carefully, her hands around her coffee cup, when the loneliness of this is so large I don't know where to put it. It's not that I can't manage, I can manage, but managing is not the same as. She stopped. The same as living, August said quietly. She looked at him. Yes, she said, exactly that. He was quiet for a moment, looking at the table. Then he said, I have been thinking about you since the roof. I want you to know that. I have been thinking about you and trying to talk myself out of telling you so, because I don't have. He looked up, and there was something naked in his gray eyes, honest and unprotected. I don't have what Vane had to offer. I don't have land or money or a house worthy of the name. What I have is my work and my hands and the. He stopped, and when he started again his voice was lower. The certainty that I have not felt in my whole life, the way I feel when I am here, at this table, with you and Caleb, and I know that's not a fair thing to lay at your feet without asking first whether you'd want it there. The lamp between them was very steady, and the night outside was very quiet, and Minnie's hands were very still on the cup. August, she said, yes. I am not afraid of work, she said. I am not afraid of plain living. I turned Cornelius Vane away not because I want to be poor, but because I will not be bought. What I want, her voice was very careful and very honest. What I want is exactly what you just described, the certainty, the feeling of being known. She paused. You know me better after 10 days and a supper than Thomas knew me in the first year. He reached across the table slowly, and she watched him reach, and when his hand covered hers on the coffee cup, she did not pull away. She turned her hand over and held his, and they sat like that in the lamplight while the night moved around the house. I'm not asking you anything tonight, he said. Tonight I'm just here. I know, she said. Tonight is enough. He walked home in the dark, and he did not feel poor at all. The weeks that followed had a quality to them that was different from anything in August's experience, a kind of accumulated tenderness, a daily deepening, like water carving stone. He came to the house not every day but often, always with a clear errand or a job to justify his presence, a section of fence that needed replacing, a door hinge that stuck, a new shelf in the kitchen for the jars of preserved vegetables that Minnie was beginning to put up for next winter. He was careful about the terms, always presenting the help as trade rather than gift, always with the same scrupulous attention to her dignity. But the pretense of pure practicality was growing thin as paper, and both of them knew it and neither of them minded. Caleb attached himself to August with the frank, wholehearted devotion of a child who has found something he did not know he was missing. He would watch for August from the front porch and break into a run when he saw him coming down the road. He dragged him to see every notable thing in the vicinity, the frog pond behind the church, the place where a hawk had nested in the big cottonwood, the curious rock that was shaped exactly like a horse's head if you looked at it from the right angle. He demanded to know what every tool in August's bag was for, and committed the answers to memory with the ferocious retention of the young. For his part, August never performed his interest in Caleb. He simply paid attention, the way he paid attention to everything fully and without reservation, as though Caleb's frogs and rocks and hawk nests were as worthy of serious consideration as anything else in the world, which to August they were. Minnie watched this and felt things she could not always look at directly. They were too bright, too close to something she had locked away carefully when Thomas died, telling herself she was being practical. One afternoon in early June, she was hanging washing on the line and August was repairing the picket fence that ran along the property's south side. And Caleb was in the vegetable garden allegedly weeding but actually examining a beetle of unusual size. And the afternoon was long and gold and breezy, and Minnie was standing with her arms raised and a wet sheet in her hands when she realized, with the sudden clarity of a bell struck, she was happy. She was happy right now, in this exact moment, with the washing and the fence and the beetle and the man with the hammer. She lowered the sheet and stood still with the weight of it. August looked up from the fence and saw her standing there with that stillness and something in her face that he could not name from 15 feet away, but that made him put his hammer down. "Minnie," he said. "I'm all right," she said. She shook out the sheet and pinned it to the line. "I was just thinking." "About what?" She looked at him over the line of white washing, the sheet billowing between them in the breeze. "About how strange it is," she said, "that things can change without your permission." He looked at her for a long moment. "Is that all right with you?" "Yes," she said, and her voice was steady and certain. "I believe it is." The thing that brought matters to a head, in the way that things in life so often do, was not a grand moment but a small, sharp, practical one. It was the middle of June, and Cornelius Vane had not taken Minnie's refusal with quite the philosophical grace he had displayed on the front path. He had not been unpleasant about it directly. He was too proud for that, but he had mentioned to Bill Hannigan at the general store, in a way that was designed to be overheard, that Minnie Harper's debt at the store was something of an embarrassment, and that a woman in her position ought to be more realistic about what her situation permitted. Word of this reached Minnie through Martha Cade, who reported it with the compressed fury of a woman who takes social cruelty personally. "He said it plain as anything," Martha told Minnie, her face red with indignation. "Right there in the store with 3 people listening, that you were foolish and that you'd come around when necessity pressed hard enough." Minnie's face went very still in the way it did when she was genuinely angry, not a shutting down but a concentrating, like a lens focusing light. "How much do I owe at the store?" she asked, her voice even. $11 and some cents, Martha said. Minnie went to her tin box under the floorboard where she kept her money and counted what she had. She had $8.40. She was $3 short. She sat on the edge of her bed with the money in her hands and allowed herself 2 minutes of genuine despair, not performance, not self-pity, just the plain acknowledgement that this was hard and that being cornered by a man's pride was a particular kind of hard that had its own distinct flavor. Then she stood up, put the money in her pocket, and went to the store to tell Bill Hannigan she would have the rest within a month. August found out about this the same way he found out about most things obliquely, from Purvis Dodd, who had been at the store and had witnessed both Vane's remark and Minnie's subsequent quiet, dignified visit to settle what she could. He went home to his room above the livery stable and sat on his bed in the early evening and looked at his own tin box, which contained $14.70. Every cent he had in the world, saved coin by coin over months of work. He looked at it for a while. He thought about what it would mean to give it away. He would not be able to pay next month's rent on his room. He would need to pick up more work and quickly. He would not be comfortable for some time. Then he thought about Minnie Harper counting her money on the edge of her bed. He could picture it perfectly, her straight back and her steady hands, and the particular loneliness of being short of what you need when someone is watching you to see if you will break. And he stopped deliberating and picked up the box. He walked to the general store, which was still open, and set the $14.70 on Bill Hannigan's counter. Hannigan looked at the money and then at August. "She said she'd have it in a month," he said carefully. "She will," August said. "This is just making sure the account's clear now." He paused. "I'd rather she didn't know where it came from, if that's possible." Hannigan was an honest man and not a gossip. He looked at August for a moment with an expression that was not quite a smile but was the warm predecessor of one. "I'll just say the account's settled," he said. "I appreciate it," August said. He walked home in the last light with an empty box and a lighter step than made any logical sense. What he did not anticipate was that Caleb would tell him. 2 days later, Caleb came running down the road to meet August with the unmistakable velocity of a child in possession of important news. "Mama's debt is paid," he announced. "She went to the store and missed her. Hannigan said it was all settled, and Mama said she doesn't understand it, but she cried a little and then got very determined looking." August absorbed this. "Is that so?" he said, keeping his voice carefully level. "Do you know who paid it?" Caleb demanded. "Because Mama wants to know and Mr. Hannigan wouldn't say." "I don't know anything about it," August said, and this was, in the most technical sense, a lie, and he hoped the Lord and Caleb would both forgive him for it. Caleb looked at him with an expression of sharp, 6-year-old skepticism that was almost alarming in its acuity. Then he let it go, because a cat had appeared on top of the fence post and was vastly more interesting. Minnie mentioned it that evening, sitting on the porch in the warm dusk, her voice thoughtful and private. "Someone paid my debt at the store," she said. "Mr. Hannigan wouldn't say who. $3 and some cents, more than enough to clear the account." She paused. "It's a mystery." August said, looking at the evening sky with great interest. She looked at him sideways. "Is it?" "Strange things happen," he said, with somewhat too much philosophical airiness. She was quiet for a while. Then she said, very softly, "If someone did that for me, I would want them to know it meant more than the money. The money is the practical thing, but the thought behind it." That someone saw she stopped. "I would want them to know it meant a great deal." August said nothing, but he felt those words settle into him like warmth, and he stopped looking at the sky and looked at her instead, and she was already looking at him, and neither of them looked away. The summer moved forward in long, golden, deliberate days. August worked more, took on every job he could find, rebuilt his savings, paid his rent, ate his beans with no complaint. He spent his time at the Harper homestead with an honesty about its purpose that had stopped pretending to be otherwise. He came because he wanted to be there. She was glad he came. Caleb ran to meet him. There was more laughter in that house than there had been in a long time, and its presence felt like something being repaired, not the roof, but the quiet structural damage that loss leaves in a life. He taught Caleb to whittle, which resulted in a series of objects that defied category but were received by Minnie with precisely the same reverence she would have given a Rembrandt, which August thought said everything about her worth knowing. He helped Minnie put up vegetables for the winter, an afternoon of boiling and sealing jars, the kitchen steamy and fragrant and chaotic, Caleb underfoot and occasionally helpful, and Minnie with her sleeves rolled and her hair escaping its pins in the heat, laughing at something August said and reaching up to push a strand off her forehead, and August looking at her and thinking with absolute clarity, "This is the life I want." He had not said so. He had been circling it for weeks, not from cowardice exactly, but from a genuine uncertainty about whether he had the right. He had so little to offer in material terms. He had no land, no house, nothing to show for himself except his work and his character, and the love he had for this woman and her boy that had grown so large by now that it was the organizing fact of his days. He thought about what she had said to Cornelius Vane, that she would not marry a man because he was the richest man in the valley. He turned this over and over. Was the opposite also true, that she would not refuse a man because he was the poorest? Or was there some floor of material security below which even her independence could not reasonably go? He had almost asked her twice. Once in July, on an evening when the light was particularly beautiful, and the mood between them was warm and close, and Caleb had gone to bed, and they had been sitting together on the porch step in the comfortable nearness of two people who have stopped performing distance. And once in August, When she had reached across the table to refill his coffee and her hand had brushed his and neither of them had moved for a moment, just stayed in that small, electric stillness. Both times he had not quite gotten to it. Both times he had felt the words arranging themselves in his chest and then had pulled back, not from fear of her rejection exactly, but from something more like reverence, the sense that the asking had to be right, had to be worthy of what he was asking for. It was in the second week of September, with the first cool edge beginning to come into the evenings, and the light going that particular honey amber of early Texas autumn, that events arranged themselves in a way that made further waiting impossible. Cornelius Vane had been building toward something since June. August had seen the shape of it in small things, the way Vane watched Minnie at church, the conversation he had started with the county assessor about outstanding homestead claims, the quiet pressure he had been applying through channels that Minnie was not fully aware of. Vane was a man accustomed to getting what he wanted, and having been refused once, he had decided to approach the problem from a different direction. He had discovered through means that were legal but not kind, that Thomas Harper's original homestead claim had a procedural deficiency in its filing, a clerical error that had never been corrected, and that this deficiency could, if challenged, be used to cloud the title to the property. It was not a sure thing. It might not have held up before a court, but it was enough to make trouble, and making trouble was sometimes enough to achieve what direct offer had failed to achieve. He had sent a letter through his lawyer, a man in San Antonio, raising the question of the title and suggesting that Mrs. Harper might want to consider whether her claim to the property was as clear as she believed. Minnie received this letter on a Monday morning and sat at her kitchen table and read it twice, and then she sat very still for a long time. She was there when August arrived that afternoon, still sitting at the table with the letter in front of her. She looked up when he came in, and the look on her face was one he had not seen before, not panic, not grief, but a deep, steady fury that she was holding very carefully, the way you hold a lit torch in a wind. "What is it?" he said, crossing to her immediately. She pushed the letter toward him. He read it. He read it again. Then he set it down on the table and stood for a moment with his hands on the table and his head bent, and the expression on his face when he looked up was something Minnie had not seen there before either, a very quiet, very contained anger. "This is Vane's doing," he said. "His lawyer's letter, but yes," she looked at the letter. "I don't know if the claim is true. I don't know enough about the filing to know. Do you have Thomas's papers, the original filing?" "In the chest in the bedroom." They spent the next 2 hours going through every paper Thomas Harper had ever filed. August was methodical and careful, sorting and reading, asking questions when he needed to, until he understood the full shape of what Thomas had filed and when. The deficiency was a date on a supporting document that did not match the date on the primary filing, almost certainly a copying error by a county clerk rather than anything Thomas had done wrong. Whether it was legally meaningful was a question beyond August's expertise. "I know a man," he said. "Jim Rourke, he's a lawyer in Hardwick, 20 miles east. He's honest and he knows land claims." He looked at her. "Will you let me ride out to see him tomorrow? I'll be back by evening." She looked at him steadily. "You don't have to, Minnie." His voice was quiet but absolute. "Let me." She was quiet for a moment, and in that moment something passed between them that was both simpler and larger than anything they had said out loud. "All right," she said. "Thank you." He rode to Hardwick the next morning, on Ferdinand, who was slow but steady, and sat in Jim Rourke's office for 2 hours going through the documents he had brought copies of. Rourke, a lean, practical man with ink-stained fingers and a direct manner, studied everything carefully. "The deficiency is real," Rourke said finally. "Whether it's actionable depends on the judge. My honest opinion. If she contests it with proper evidence of continuous residence and improvement, which she clearly has, most judges would find in her favor, but it would cost her to fight it. Legal fees, time, the stress of it." He paused. "Vane knows that. That's the whole point." "What would it cost to correct the filing proactively?" August asked. "Before any formal challenge is brought." Rourke looked at him thoughtfully. There's a process for amending homestead filings. It costs less to do it right and ahead of time than to fight it in court. Maybe $12, $15, including my fee if everything goes smooth. August nodded. Draw up what needs drawing up, he said. I'll have the money. He rode home thinking about where the money would come from, and by the time he arrived in Callow Creek he had worked it out. He would go to Garrett, the rancher whose stone wall he had built, and ask for an advance on the winter work Garrett had mentioned needing done. Garrett was a fair man. He would ask and the answer would probably be yes. He went to see Garrett that evening. The answer was yes. He came to Minnie's the following morning with the papers from work, and they sat at the kitchen table again with a very different quality to the sitting. Not the quiet despair of the previous afternoon, but something purposeful and forward-looking. This is the amendment process, he explained, spreading Rourke's paperwork out. We file this with the county with the supporting evidence of your residence and improvements, the garden, the repairs, the livestock records Thomas kept. Once it's filed and accepted, the deficiency is corrected and there's nothing for Vane's lawyer to work with. He looked up. It'll cost money. I have it. Please let me. August. She stopped him, not with coldness but with the steady warmth that was particular to her. I will let you help, but I need to know how you've managed this. You don't have, she stopped. You work for everything you have. I got an advance from Garrett, he said. Against the winter work, it's not charity, it's a loan to myself from future labor. She studied him. And the debt at the store, she said quietly. In June, he was still. I know it was you, she said. I've known for some time. Mr. Hannigan is a good man, but Caleb is observant. Her voice was low and without accusation. You spent your savings. I had some to spare, he said, which was not entirely true, but was the best he could do. August. She said his name in that particular way she had, the way that unlocked something in him. Why? He looked at her across the table, and the honest answer was the only one available to him. Because I could not stand the thought of you being pressed by that man's pride, he said. Because $3 should not be the thing that forces a woman with your strength and your integrity into a corner. He paused, and when he continued, his voice was different, lower, more deliberate. Because I love you. I have loved you for long enough that I can no longer pretend otherwise, and I know I have nothing to offer that any reasonable man would consider sufficient, and I know that you have already refused the most generous material offer in this valley, and if you tell me that I am not, he stopped. He started again, differently. I am not asking for an answer right now. I just wanted you to know why the debt and why Rourke and why any of it. His voice had run out. He sat there across the table from her in the morning light, entirely exposed with nothing between them. Minnie was very still. Then she said, August, will you, Minnie, he started at the same moment. They both stopped. She reached across the table, the same gesture as when she had refilled his coffee, but this time she covered his hand with both of hers and held it, and when she spoke her voice had the quality of something long held back finding its way out into the light. I was going to ask you something, she said. But I think you were about to ask me something first, and I want to hear it. He looked at her face, which he knew now as well as he knew anything, the particular brown of her eyes and the set of her mouth, and the way the morning light fell on her cheekbone. He looked at her and he understood that he had been halfway through asking her something for the past several months and had never quite finished, and that this was the moment to finish. Minnie Harper, he said, and his voice was steady and quiet and real. I am a man with a good hammer and a rented room and a horse that is considerably past his prime. I have no land and no money to speak of and no standing in this town beyond what people think of my work. I am asking you to be my wife not because I can give you what you need in the way of security, though I will work every day of my life toward it, but because I believe you and I together are better than either of us apart. Because your boy already calls me by my first name and the sound of it, he had to stop briefly. I know I am not the richest man in the valley. I am very possibly the poorest, but I am asking anyway and I need to ask before I lose my nerve, so will you? Yes, she said. He blinked. He had more words prepared. "I haven't." "Yes," she said again, and the smile that she had been keeping carefully in check for months came out now, full and brilliant and irreversible. "August, yes, before you finish." He stared at her for one full second. Then he laughed, a sudden, helpless, joyful laugh, and she laughed too, and he stood up from the table and she stood up and he crossed to her in 2 steps and she put her arms around him and he held her. And for a moment neither of them said anything because there was nothing that needed saying. When he finally spoke, his voice was rough at the edges. "You were going to ask me something," he said against her hair. "I was going to ask if you would stay for supper," she said, muffled against his shoulder, and he could feel her laughing again. "Yes," he said, holding her tighter. "Always." Caleb came in from the yard 20 minutes later and found his mother and August sitting together at the kitchen table, her hand in his, both of them with a lightness about them that was new and visible as sunrise. He stopped in the doorway and looked at them with the careful, comprehensive gaze of a 6-year-old processing important information. "Are you going to get married?" he asked, with the directness of a child who does not see the point of circumlocution. "We are," August said. Caleb considered this for a moment. "Good," he said, with great finality, and went to look for his whittling knife. There were people in Callow Creek who had opinions about August Redmond and Minnie Harper's engagement, and none of them, in the end, were as important as the fact of it. Martha Cade, who had worried about August's lack of means, revised her opinion within a week after observing the quality of his attention to Minnie, and concluded that there were different kinds of wealth, and that she had perhaps been measuring the wrong kind. Purvis Dodd was delighted for reasons that were mostly about his sustained dislike of Cornelius Vane, which he felt had been vindicated. The general store and the barber shop and the church had their discussions, and mostly those discussions landed on approval. People liked August, even those who had not thought him a match for Minnie, because he was the kind of man whose quality accumulated on you over time, like respect earned. Cornelius Vane heard the news on a Thursday morning and sat with it for 2 days, and on the Saturday he came to the Harper homestead one final time. He did not come with roses or deeds. He came with his hat in his hand, and he stood on the path and asked to speak with Minnie, and when she came to the door he said, with the stiff dignity of a proud man doing something that cost him, "Mrs. Harper, I have heard your news and I have directed my lawyer to withdraw the letter concerning the property title. There was no real case there and it was unworthy of me to pursue it. I want you to know that." He paused. "I wish you well." Minnie looked at him with those direct, compassionate eyes. "Thank you, Mr. Vane," she said. "That is a generous thing." He put his hat on and rode away, and this time it was finished in a way that the first time had not quite been, because this time there was nothing he was waiting for. The amendment to the homestead filing was completed anyway. Jim Rourke filed it. It was accepted by the county, and the title was clarified for good, which was the right thing regardless of Vane's withdrawal. August paid Rourke from the Garrett advance and worked the winter work to make it back. They were married on a Saturday in October 1878 in the small white church of Callow Creek, with Pastor Briggs officiating and a congregation that nearly filled the pews. Minnie wore a dress that she had sewn herself from fabric she had been saving, a deep rose color that she had been told was impractical for Texas, but had bought anyway, years earlier, for a reason she had not then been able to name. Her hair was down for the first time in August's experience, dark and thick past her shoulders, and the sight of it did to him exactly what he should have expected it would do, which was to reduce him briefly to a man who had forgotten every word he had prepared. Caleb stood beside August as what he solemnly informed everyone was his assistant, wearing his Sunday clothes and a grave expression that periodically dissolved into enormous grins when he forgot to maintain it. When Pastor Briggs asked if anyone had objection, the church was silent. When August and Minnie said their words to each other, their voices were steady, and their eyes were only on each other. When August put his grandmother's ring on Minnie's finger, a simple gold band that had been in his coat pocket since New Mexico, carried without quite knowing why, his hands were entirely still. After the ceremony, Minnie's neighbor Martha had organized a gathering in the churchyard with food and a fiddle player named Old Sam Garrett, who was the rancher's father-in-law and played with arthritic hands and perfect feeling. The afternoon was long and golden in the way of Texas autumn, and people danced in the churchyard and ate and talked, and at some point Caleb fell asleep in his Sunday clothes on a blanket under the cottonwood, and a half-dozen women took turns being quietly devastated by how sweet he looked. August and Minnie stood together at the edge of the gathering in the last of the afternoon light, her hand in his arm, watching their town celebrate with them. "Well, Mrs. Redmond," he said, tasting the name. She turned to look at him, and her face was the face he would know for the rest of his life, open and warm and true, with that deep, steady light behind the brown eyes. "Well, Mr. Redmond," she said. He lifted her hand from his arm and held it in both of his, the way she had held his hand across the kitchen table, and he looked at her with the full, unguarded feeling of a man who has found the thing he did not know he was looking for. "I want to tell you something," he said. "Tell me. The first time I spoke to you, the porch board, I went home and couldn't stop thinking about those 10 minutes. I thought about how that was probably foolish, given everything." He paused. "I was right that it was foolish. I was wrong that it mattered." She leaned up and kissed him, in front of the whole town and the fiddle player and the sleeping boy under the cottonwood, and Old Sam Garrett hit a high, sweet note right at that moment as though he had been saving it, and several people cheered. The winter of 1878 and 1879 was a hard one by Texas standards, with cold that drove down from the north, and a stretch of days in January where the wind was strong enough to make the house creak. But the house was warm. August had spent the weeks before winter came reinforcing the insulation, caulking every gap, ensuring the stove was properly seated. He was building a home the way he built everything, carefully and with attention to what would be needed. The roof he had repaired and held perfect through every storm, and no water troubled the butter dish. They lived in Minnie's house, which became theirs, and it was a tight fit but a good one. August built a new room onto the east side of the house in the late spring proper construction, with lumber he had earned and seasoned over the winter, and this room became Caleb's, and Caleb received it with the solemnity of a prince receiving a kingdom, and immediately began to decorate its walls with drawings of horses and tools. August worked, as he had always worked, steadily and without complaint, and his reputation grew. By the spring of 1879, he was no longer just the man you called for odd jobs. He was the man you called for real construction. Bill Hannigan's store needed an addition. The new schoolhouse needed to be built properly to replace the cramped one-room affair. 2 families building homesteads on the edge of town needed houses that would last. August's work was good and known to be good, and there is no better advertising in a small town than known good work. He was still not a wealthy man by the end of 1879, but he was a man who was building towards something, and the direction was clear. Caleb turned 7 in December 1879 and received a proper set of small woodworking tools from August, not toys, but real tools scaled to his hands, with a lesson in how to use each one that Caleb received with the dedication he applied to everything that mattered to him. He was in Miss Porter's school now and doing well, full of questions about everything from arithmetic to the nature of lightning, and Miss Porter had written Minnie a note saying she had rarely had a student so genuinely curious, which Minnie had read to August at supper, and which had made him look at the boy with an expression of such unguarded pride that Caleb had demanded to know what it meant. "It means," August told him, "that you are remarkable," which you already knew. "I did know," Caleb confirmed, completely without vanity, as a simple statement of fact, and both his parents laughed until they cried. In March of 1880, Minnie told August she was expecting. She told him in the kitchen on a Sunday morning, quiet and direct, and with that particular expression she had when she was delivering information she knew would require some time to fully land. He stood in the kitchen with his coffee cup halfway to his mouth, and then set it down slowly and looked at her. And the look on his face moved through surprise to understanding to something so large and warm that she had to look away for a moment, because it was almost too much to receive directly. He crossed the kitchen and held her face in his hands and kissed her forehead. "Are you all right?" he asked first, because that was who he was. "I'm very well," she said. "Very well." He pulled her to him. "A baby," he said, against her hair. "In September," she said. He stood there holding her with that still, complete quality he had when something mattered enormously. And outside the Texas morning was beginning, the light coming in strips through the shutters, and somewhere nearby Caleb was up and could be heard talking to himself about something involving beetles, and the world was exactly itself, hard and bright and good. They told Caleb at breakfast. He received the news with a period of careful contemplation, during which he ate 3 bites of cornmeal, and then announced that he would prefer a brother but would accept a sister if one was produced, and that either way he planned to teach them everything he knew about frogs, which August thought was a generous and sensible position. The summer of 1880 was long and full. August finished the schoolhouse in June, and the whole town came out for the completion in a way that was partly celebration and partly recognition. People had noticed over 2 years what kind of man he was. Not flashy, not loud, not positioned at the center of things, but reliably, steadfastly there building things that held, keeping his word, being the kind of neighbor and community member that small places depend on without always acknowledging. Even Cornelius Vane, who had by now recovered his dignity and directed his energies elsewhere. There was a widow in Hardwick, people said, who was more amenable, had been heard to say that August Redmond did fine work, and had given him a job repairing a section of the Vane Ranch's outbuildings, which August had done with the same quality he gave everything, without regard for the history between them. Minnie was large with the baby in August and blooming in the way that she tended to bloom under good circumstances. A kind of vital, full presence, more herself than usual rather than less. She still did her sewing, adapted for the season, and still tended her garden, which had expanded over 2 years into a proper kitchen garden that provided a good portion of their food. She and August had planted apple trees along the south fence the previous fall, a project of the future, trees that would not bear for years, but that represented a bet on years ahead. And in the summer of 1880, those trees were small and green and growing. The baby came in September, on a Tuesday night when the air had just begun to carry the first suggestion of cooler weather. He came after a labor that was neither easy nor dangerous, with Dr. Pierce in attendance, and Martha Cade in the kitchen, and August waiting in the front room in a state of barely controlled uselessness that he handled by fixing the hinge on the front door, which had been squeaking, and cleaning all his tools for the second time that week. When Dr. Pierce opened the bedroom door and said, "A boy, Mr. Redmond, mother and child both well," August sat down in the nearest chair with the particular bonelessness of a man from whom great tension has just departed. He went in when they let him, and Minnie was sitting up in their bed with the baby in her arms and her hair down, and her face flushed from the work of it, and she looked at him when he came through the door with those brown eyes that were full of everything, exhaustion and joy and love, and that particular triumph that belongs to women who have done something enormous. The baby was small and red, and had a tremendous scowl, which suggested even at an hour old that he had opinions. August sat beside Minnie, and she put the baby into his arms, and he held him with the careful, full attention he gave to things that mattered, which was everything. "Hello," he said quietly to this small person who was scowling at the ceiling. "He looks angry," Caleb said from the doorway where he had been allowed to stand. "He's just thinking," August said. "What should we call him?" Minnie asked. August looked up from the baby. He and Minnie had discussed names tentatively, but nothing had been settled because names wanted to fit the person and you couldn't be sure of the fit until you met them. He looked at the baby, at the scowl and the dark fuzz of hair and the small, precise fingers already curled with purpose. "Thomas," he said, "if you agree." He looked at Minnie. "Thomas August, if the whole name is wanted." Minnie was quiet for a moment, and her eyes filled in a way she did not try to prevent. "Yes," she said softly, "that's right, Thomas August Redmond." The name settled over the room like something fitting perfectly into the place it was made for. Caleb considered this from the doorway. "Thomas," he repeated, testing it. "All right, I'll call him Tom." He looked at his parents with the authority of an elder sibling. "He should know from the beginning that I am going to teach him everything." "He's 1 hour old," August pointed out. "It's not too early to start," Caleb said, with his mother's calm certainty. They were all four together in the lamplight, in the house that August had improved and enlarged and made sound, the house that was theirs now, in every meaning of the word. Outside, Callow Creek went on in its stubborn, alive way, and the apple trees along the south fence were making their slow progress, and Ferdinand the horse was asleep in the small stable August had built, and the vegetable garden was put to bed for the fall, and the roof held. The years moved forward with the particular quality of good years, not without difficulty, because difficulty is the nature of the West and the nature of life, but held together by something solid. The spring of 1881 found August with enough work that he had taken on a young man named Daniel Pike as a helper, which meant that August Redmond was no longer a man who worked for others but a man who employed another, which was a different thing, and marked a change he thought about more than once with a quiet, private satisfaction. He bought a small piece of land on the edge of town in 1881, 4 acres, not a cattle spread, not a wheat farm, but a good piece of ground with a proper well and room enough for a workshop and a kitchen garden, and the apple trees that were now 2 years into their growing. He built the workshop himself, of course, and it became the place where the best furniture in Callow Creek was made, tables and chairs and cupboards and bedsteads, with the clean, sturdy precision that was August's way in everything. Caleb turned 10 in December 1882, and was by then such a fixture of August's workshop that Daniel Pike had started calling him the third partner, which made Caleb nearly incoherent with pride. He was a serious, bright-eyed boy with his father's dark eyes and his mother's directness, and a quality of his own, a particular generosity of spirit, an interest in people that made everyone he talked to feel attended to. August watched him and felt, sometimes, the slightly dazed gratitude of a man who had come into something he had not known to hope for and found it exceeded expectation. Tom was 3 in 1883 and was, as Caleb had predicted from the beginning, someone with strong opinions. He had Minnie's chestnut hair and August's gray eyes, and a personality that was, from very early, unmistakably its own, bold and warm and occasionally reckless, inclined to run before he had quite mastered walking, inclined to speak before he had quite mastered the full sentence, inclined always toward the largest and most interesting version of everything. He adored his brother with a wholehearted, uncomplicated devotion that Caleb bore with the patient dignity of an older sibling who has privately felt this all along. In the spring of 1883, Minnie sat in the kitchen one evening after supper, the boys asleep, the house quiet, the lamp burning low, and wrote a letter to her mother in Missouri, who had not been able to come to the wedding but who had sent a quilt that was still on the bed. She wrote about the workshop and the land and the boys and the apple trees, which had flowered for the first time that spring, and she wrote about August with the particular honesty she had always applied to things she cared about most. "He is a man," she wrote, "who builds things. Not only the practical things, the walls and the roofs and the furniture, though those are good and true. He builds the days. He builds the mornings and the evenings and the small, ordinary moments that I used to think of as the spaces between living and have come to understand are the whole of it. I turned down the richest man in the valley for him, which the town of Callow Creek has never entirely gotten over, and I would do it again in a heartbeat, and I would do it faster." She read it over and folded it and sealed it. Then she sat for a moment in the quiet kitchen and listened to the house, to the creak of the boards settling and the sound of August moving in the workshop, a late task, the familiar rhythm of him. And she felt the full weight of her life, and it was a good weight, the kind that comes from things built well and held long. She put on a shawl and went out across the yard to the workshop, where August was finishing the surface of a table for the pastor's new dining room, running a plane along the grain of the wood with long, even strokes. He looked up when she came in. "Boy's asleep," he said. "Tom took some convincing," she said. "He wanted to discuss horses." "He always wants to discuss horses," August said, and set the plane down and straightened, and looked at her in that way he had fully, without any held back, the way he had always looked at her. She crossed the workshop to him, and he put his arm around her and she leaned into his side, and they stood together and looked at the table taking shape under his hands. "It's beautiful work," she said. "It'll hold," he said, which was his standard assessment of things he had made well. "That's what I love about you," she said. "You never oversell." He laughed that slow, warm laugh of his, and kissed her temple, and they stood together in the workshop while the Texas night moved around them, and the apple trees were growing in the dark outside, and the boys were sleeping in their rooms, and the house was warm and sound. The spring of 1884 brought Minnie the news she had been hoping for and half expected. She was expecting again. She told August in the kitchen on a Sunday morning, the same way she had told him about Tom, with the same directness and the same expression, and he responded the same way, setting his cup down slowly, looking at her with that full, warm, enormous look, and then said with perfect seriousness, "Tom is going to be impossible." "Tom is going to be triumphant," Minnie said, laughing. "He has been asking for a sibling since he was 2. "He has been asking for a horse since he was 2, August said. "He asks for everything. He is your son," Minnie said. "He is very much his mother's son," August said, and she raised her eyebrow, and he smiled at her with the smile that had not changed since the first morning on her roof, that sunrise smile, gradual and then all at once. The baby came in November 1884, and it was a girl this time, which Tom received with the absolute equanimity of a child who has gotten most things he wanted and can afford to be gracious. She had Minnie's dark eyes and August's broad brow and a quality of stillness that seemed slightly miraculous given her parentage, and she was named Clara, after Minnie's grandmother whose butter dish sat safely on the kitchen shelf. Callow Creek grew through the 1880s as the West continued to change. The railroad came within 30 miles, which changed commerce. The Indian Territory to the north was gradually, unjustly open to settlement in ways that August and Minnie discussed with the sober recognition of people who had seen what was taken from those who had been there first, and who did not pretend that the progress around them came free of cost. There were Comanche families who had been in that land for generations before any of them, and the displacement of those families was a wrong that sat uncomfortably alongside the life August and Minnie were building. A complexity that they did not resolve but did not pretend away, and that they spoke honestly about to their children as they grew old enough to understand. Caleb turned 15 in 1887, and was, by then, his father's apprentice in every real sense, learning the trade with a seriousness that surprised no one who had watched him grow up. He was tall and dark-eyed, and had his mother's way with people and his father's way with wood, and August watched him work sometimes with the quiet, private amazement of a man who still cannot quite believe his luck. Tom turned 7 the same year and was, as he had always been, in motion, on horses whenever he could arrange it, in the creek in summer, in the workshop dismantling things to see how they worked. He had August's gray eyes and Minnie's total absence of self-doubt, and a joy in living that was so natural and so large, it made the people around him feel more alive. Clara at 3 was watchful and precise, and had already established a personality of such singular authority that Caleb said she was going to be the most formidable of all of them, and August and Minnie both agreed this was probably right. In the summer of 1888, Minnie came to August in the workshop one evening and said she had been thinking about something, and the way she said it, careful and warm and direct, meant it was something real. "I want to tell you something," she said. "Tell me," he said, setting down his tools, giving her his full attention. "10 years ago," she said, "almost exactly, the day you came to my door with your carpenter's bag and asked me to let you fix my roof." She paused, and her eyes were warm with the memory. "I knew something was different. I did not know what, but I knew." He looked at her for a long moment. "The first time I spoke to you," he said, "before the roof, the porch board, the 10 minutes, I thought about you the whole walk home." "I thought about you too," she said. He crossed the workshop to her, and she let him take her hands, and they stood together in the lamplit workshop with the smell of fresh wood and oil around them and 10 years of days between them. "Are you happy?" he asked, and it was not an anxious question, not a needing of reassurance, but the question of a man who asks because the answer matters and always will. "I am," she said, with the plain, absolute certainty she had always applied to true things. "I am as happy as I know how to be." He lifted her hands to his lips and kissed them, the hands that had tended the garden and raised the children and turned down the richest man in the valley and held his on a kitchen table one late night while a lamp burned between them. "Good," he said. "So am I outside." The Texas evening was settling in, blue gold and wide, the kind of evening that goes on forever in the way that only good things do. The apple trees along the south fence were heavy with fruit 7 years of growing, and they bore well now. The workshop smelled of cedar and honest labor. In the house, Caleb was reading something at the kitchen table, and Tom was almost certainly outside on the fence talking to the horses, and Clara was asleep in the room they had made for her with the quilt from Missouri on her bed. The whole of it, the house and the land and the children and the years, was solid and real and true, built by two people out of work and honesty, and the kind of love that does not announce itself loudly but simply arrives, one morning, one evening, one ordinary day at a time, and stays. August Redmond had come to Callow Creek with nothing but his tools and his hands and his willingness to be entirely himself, and Minnie Harper had looked at that and seen, with the clear-eyed precision she applied to everything important, exactly what it was worth. She had been right. The poorest man in the valley had asked, and she had said yes before he finished, and the answer had built a life as solid and enduring as the best work his hands had ever made, which is to say, it would hold. It would hold for a very long time.